learners, and welcome to the 18th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I began a detailed close reading and explication of Robert Frost's poem Home Burial, and I will conclude that discussion right now and also talk a little bit about some other poems and conclude our discussion of Robert Frost as a figure with this lecture. I ended the last lecture with the stanza which ended with this line. You had stood the spade up against the wall outside in the entry, for I saw it. Right? And before that, the woman had accused and accosted the man with these words. You could sit there with the stains on your shoes of the fresh earth from your own baby's grave and talk about your everyday concerns. You had stood the spade up against the wall, outside there in the entry, for I saw it. Right? So, what seems to affect most powerfully this woman is not just the fact that she has lost a child or that they have lost a child, but there's something very isolating in the sight of her husband, the father of her child, doing this thing, committing this act. He has dug a grave, he's resting after the labor, he's resting the spade against the wall, and it seems as if he's going about a very ordinary act. The consequence of this act, whether it reflects insensitivity or indifference on the part of the man, that is quite irrelevant and unnecessary. But rather, there's something about the sight of this act which prevents and makes the woman unable to share her grief with the man. The sight of her husband digging their child's grave isolates her even further in her own grief. Now, in the accuracy with which Robert Frost describes these emotions, the precision with which Robert Frost describes these thoughts, the realism and the verisimilitude with which Robert Frost is able to articulate the specific reason, the voice, the arguments of this woman have to do with two things. On one hand, as I mentioned in my earlier lecture, this poem comes from an experience that Robert Frost had. He and his wife Eleanor, they had lost their child, and it led to a deepening, long-standing emotional rift between Robert Frost and his wife Eleanor. So this is autobiographical. The source of the power of these lines comes from actual experiences that the poet had. On the other hand, however, while that is true, that it comes from actual experiences, there is something about the complexity and the power of grief that this poem describes and connects itself to other explorations of loss in the 20th century. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the 20th century, and especially the work of poets in the 20th century, reinvents this very old genre of the elegy. The elegy is essentially a poem that performs the work of mourning. However, while earlier elegies substituted the figure of the dead or lost person with a poetic image and thereby produced an act of consolation, most powerful 20th century elegies refuse to be consoled. They present the disconsolate figure of the poet or speaker as an almost pleasurable state of being. There is some satisfaction the poems gain and the poets gain in describing exactly how angry, disconsolate, unendingly sad, and really just implacably sad their protagonists are. And Robert Frost's protagonist, or one of the protagonists of this poem, Home Burial, the woman, fits that figure, the disconsolate, refusing to be consoled figure of the 20th century modern elegy. So that is how these lines end. And let us quickly read through till the end of this poem and say something about this poem before moving on. In response, the man laughs. I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed. God, if I don't believe I'm cursed. Right? So the man is astounded. He's just stunned that this can be the source of his wife's grief. The fact that she saw him resting the spade, she saw the dirt rolling down his shoes, etc. These acts. He's laughing because he cannot process, he cannot compute how this act would show his insensitivity or force her to acknowledge or think that somehow he is not sharing with her and she's alone in her grief. So he is astounded because these acts have nothing to do with the articulation, the expression, or the processing and the living with of grief. The man has his grief and he keeps it aside in order to perform these practical, necessary, physical functions. Right? And so he's astounded because for him there is no possible alternative. He could not afford to continue grieving and let the functions of life remain unattended to. He could not refuse the act of digging a grave and burying the body of this dead child, because that was simply not an option. So irrespective of what he was feeling, disconsolate he was, how deep his grief was, he simply had to perform this function. And that explains his laughter. It's a very cynical, dark, and almost sinister laughter, because he's saying, what else can I do but laugh? I mean, it is ridiculous that I am being called disconsolate or insensitive because I did what had to be done. And yet, this laughter produces a deeper reflection from the woman who says, I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day will rot the best birch fence a man can build. So she remembers a quote. She remembers the exact words that he seems to have spoken immediately after or around that time when he dug the grave for their child. He said, he made a comment, a very practical, farmer-like, very expert construction advice. He gave someone very practical and precise advice related to the construction of the fence. He says, the best birch fence a man can build. So birch is a kind of tree, and a birch fence is a fence that's made from the wood of a birch tree. And he's saying that 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day. That is, birch as a wood is not very resistant to moisture or water. So it's not a good choice of tree or choice of wood to use while building a fence, because fences need to be able to withstand moisture and rain. And so hearing these words suggests to the woman that this man has entered a different world. He is no longer on the same planet as her. She is struggling with such intractable grief, and he is offering advice on the quality and the water resistance of particular kinds of wood. How can he possibly be sharing her grief if this is how his mind can work in a time like this? And then she explains these words. Think of it. Talk like that at such a time. What had how long it takes a birch to rot to do with what was in the darkened parlor? You couldn't care. The nearest friends can go with anyone to death, comes so far short that they might as well try and not go at all. No, from the time when one is sick to death, one is alone, and he dies more alone. Friends make pretense of following to the grave, but before one is in it, their minds are turned, and making the best of their way back to life, and living people, and things they understand. But the world's evil. I won't have grief, so if I can change it. Oh, I won't, I won't. So here is a reflection on grief and humanity and community. What the woman is saying is, what's the point of friends, or what's the point of human society, or what's the point of even talking? What's the point of trying to share one's grief with someone if they cannot accompany you when you're feeling so much grief, when you're so completely burdened by grief as to think of dying, as to think that death would be a better alternative than to living with such grief? In that darkest, most despairing moment, what is the point of a friendship or human companionship if they abandon you? If they say something very practical like, you cannot continue grieving, you must forget or keep aside your emotions and focus on practical matters. If this is what a man can say, then it is better not to have the company of such a man or such a husband or such a companion. And why is that? The loneliness of death is what the woman is confronted with in these days and weeks after the death of a child. She wants to die lonely like her child has just died. And every attempt at companionship or consolation seems like pretension, seems like a falsehood. Right? So she is really living with grief. Grief is the beginning and the end of her existence during these times. And she says, but the world's evil. I won't have grief so if I can change it. That is, she does not want to have anything to do with the world because she is living a truer world. The truer world is that world which her grief has created around her. She does not want to take part in this real world because it seems like a false world. Okay? So this is her denial of reality and her acceptance of the reality that grief has made for her. Nobody can say that this is an illogical account. Nobody can say that this is too emotional. Nobody can say, at least in that space of the house inhabited by a man and his wife, nobody can say that she is not speaking in a realistic manner. And yet this is what her husband says. There, you have said it all and you feel better. You won't go now. You're crying. Close the door. The heart's gone out of it. Why keep it up? Amy, there's someone coming down the road. So the man tries to salvage some emotional comfort from this very damning verdict. The man seeks to find some relief in the fact that at least she has said things, even though she is accusing him, even though he comes out looking worse at the end of this monologue. He is happy that at least she is saying things to him as opposed to keeping things secret, suppressed, buried inside. Home burial, the word burial, describes not just the physical or literal burial of a child, but also the burial that take place every day with each breath, the burial of things that cannot be said or things that might have been said but are difficult to say because of the kinds of expectations that people have from each other and especially their most intimate partners. In this case, the man is relieved that the emotions and the words which were buried until now have been disinterred. Through an act of violence, the grave has been dug open. The grave that their marriage had become has been dug open, and the words which had been buried, thinking they were dead, are now alive between them, the man and his wife. And then finally, some more words. The woman says, you think the talk is all. I must go somewhere out of this house. How can I make you? And then again the man says, if you do. She was opening the door wider. Where do you mean to go? First tell me that. I'll follow and bring you back by force. I will. So again, we are back at the kind of skirmish, the kind of intellectual, emotional firing back and forth between these two parties. After this long monologue, the husband tries to find some relief, and the wife says, it's not about the words. It's not that once the words have been articulated, our lives will become better. She still wants to exert and articulate and express her anger in some way. She still means to go out of the house, leave that space in order to be alone with her grief, because that is exactly what she is unable to do in the presence of this man. In response, the man says that he will bring her back, that he will not allow her to be alone with her grief. There is something very egotistical about this refusal. There's something very masculine about this refusal. And this is what the man says, that he will bring her back. So at the end, it might seem that the poem is giving the man the last word and giving some kind of importance to physical action and not giving as much importance to the emotional struggle, the process by which the woman deals with her emotions. Nonetheless, the poem has given enough of a position to both of these perspectives, and it remains an undecided monologue that gives a lot of weight to both parties. That was Home Burial by Robert Frost, and we will quickly move towards a conclusion of Frost's work as well as this collection, that is North of Boston. There is a poem titled The Death of a Hired Man, which is very similar to Home Burial, and it is a poem that occurs a little bit later in North of Boston. At first sight, the Death of a Hired Man might seem to offer a radical contrast to Home Burial. That is, The Death of a Hired Man is also another dialogue between husband and wife. It also sets up a binary between the practical man and the woman of feeling. But in The Death of a Hired Man, rather than assail each other, that is, the husband and wife do not debate or almost attack each other, but rather they go about a relationship. They seem to move closer to a reconciliation as they articulate their differences. Right? And in this case, what has happened is Silas, an old farmhand, has returned to a house. The house is occupied by a woman named Mary and her husband Warren. They run a farm, and it's very difficult to run a farm. It is north of Boston. It is north of New England, a very sparse, difficult country, very cold, sparsely populated. Nature is harsh and unforgiving. Human labor is hard to find. And so maintaining a farm is the greatest challenge that these human beings are dealing with. And Warren, the man who runs the farm, is always struggling. And in this case, the two, Warren and his wife, have a visitor. The visitor is a man named Silas. Now, it so happens, and we learn from the poem, that in the past, Silas has done a little unpaid work for them in return for food and lodging. Times are hard, and there's not enough money to pay him. But at haying time, when there is real farm work to be done, Silas always finds he can work for cash somewhere else. Right? So this is the background. Warren and Mary need help. They need help, but they cannot pay a lot for that help. At the times when most help is needed, Silas goes and works for people who can pay him more. At the time when less help is needed, Silas comes and works for free. Silas does unpaid work in return for shelter and food. This happens to be one of those times. There is less work, it is very cold, Silas would like shelter and food, and this is probably the reason why Silas is at their doorstep. This time, Warren says, he has vowed not to take him back. Silas is waiting in the parlor where he has been reminiscing about the time he and a young college boy named Harold were haying together. And Silas is remembering things, and by describing what Silas is remembering, Frost himself is remembering. Frost, in London, where he wrote this poem, is remembering New England, the time he spent as a poultry farmer working the land, meeting people, encountering strange things, learning about the place and the land from its people. Frost is remembering. What is he remembering? Uh, how these rural folk, these country people, would find the virtue of learning a classical language like Latin. And Silas, in this case, is concerned that Harold, the young man who is learning Latin, is becoming, quote, the fool of books, unquote. And Silas wants to teach this young man, Harold, the practical art of building a haystack, his one accomplishment. This is a tension that stays throughout Robert Frost's work. Frost was a poet. He was educated at Harvard and Dartmouth. He also spent some time teaching. But Frost was also a farmer. He also remained skeptical about the labor of the mind. He also remained a deep apologist for the labor of the body. So this opposition between the practical and the intellectual is in keeping with another opposition that is between Mary and Warren's different understandings of home. Warren says that Silas should not have come here because Silas has not done enough work to earn a place in their home. This is Warren's argument for not giving shelter to Silas, and this is what he says to Mary. These are words from the poem. Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. Right? They have to take you in. This is, there's no choice. There's a kind of moral injunction. It is morally binding on people to accept their family or people who call their house their home. This is Warren's idea. In response, Mary says, I should have called it, that is home, I should have called it something you somehow haven't to deserve. Now, what does it mean, haven't to deserve? What Mary says when she says home is something you haven't to deserve, she's saying you don't have to earn your place at home. You don't have to create the moral pressure on your family to accept you in their home by doing something that demonstrates your worth. You don't have to do physical work to earn a place at home. And this is the difference between husband and wife. The man thinks that moral values are earned through physical labor. That unless one does something that is uncomfortable, difficult, very, very painful, hard, unless one engages in tasks one does not wish to, labor is not something one would be naturally inclined to undertake. And yet, there are circumstances in which we are forced to undertake labor. We don't have a choice. It is only when one successfully undertakes this labor without having a choice that Warren feels that people earn the right to be accepted at home. Mary, however, counters this and says, it is not about physical work. It is about having enough sympathy, empathy, moral human sympathy for another human being, whether or not they are related by blood, whether or not they have earned a place, whether or not they have contributed to the family's GDP, whether or not they have contributed to the family's annual income by contributing their labor. These considerations are not important. Home is where you let people in, whether or not they have done something to deserve it. It is this difference between husband and wife that creates a very powerful sense of what this poem is describing. There are several binaries that structure this poem. Obviously that of man and woman, husband and wife, but also father and mother. And now these are the binaries that Frost's collection creates and Frost's oeuvre as a poet creates. Binaries of man and wife map onto other binaries such as the political binaries of Republican and Democrat, the binaries of hardness and nurturing, the binaries of obligation and right, obligation and a moral right. And these binaries are somewhat resolved in the ending of the poem. Now, it seems that most readers would argue that Mary has the best of the argument. But it is actually not that easy to decide who has the last word or who wins the argument, Mary or Warren. There is enough evidence to conclude that her husband Warren's attitude softens over the course of the poem. He goes in to talk to Silas, uh, and then he returns, and these are the words from the poem. Returned too soon, it seemed to her, slipped to her side, caught up her hand, and waited. So, Mary and Warren decide that he will keep her. That is, he agrees to listen to Mary and give Silas shelter. But they have spent too much time arguing. And it is cold, and Silas is old and probably hungry, probably sick, probably in need of urgent care, but he's too diffident and not open enough, not bold enough to say these things. While the two have been arguing, Silas has been waiting outside in the cold. Warren goes to tell Silas to come in. He has been prevailed upon to take this decision after his argument with Mary. Warren returns, too soon it seems to Mary, slips to her side, takes up her hand, and waits in silence. When Warren doesn't say anything, Mary asks, "Warren?" She questioned. "Dead," was all he answered. And that's how the poem ends. So it seems that the silence, the reaction, the way Warren's body reacts, the way his body is more subdued, less active, and generally more subdued, seems to convey a sense of regret. He seems to agree with Mary, but also he seems to regret that he didn't agree with her early enough. And it was the delay they caused due to his arguments, due to his resistance to Mary, which has led to Silas's death. This is one way to read the poem, and we can think of the implications of the poem in some detail. This whole conversation is overshadowed by that one stark word, dead. Insofar as Silas dies while they're talking, it's as if death were itself a kind of home, a finality that dwarfs both their human concerns. The balance between Warren's and Mary's view of things is intended to settle back toward even with this ending. So it seems to me that the poem is trying to describe a reconciliation. But it's also possible to read this ending as tipping the scales back towards the man's side, towards Warren's side. The death of Silas, if we can say that the poem presents the death of Silas as a natural and somewhat sustainable way of describing life, then we can see that the poem is favoring a secular, masculine, and somewhat minimalist and physical view of life and language, as opposed to a feminine, Christian, and sentimental one. So the difference between these two readings, a sentimental, feminine, or Christian reading, and a somewhat physical, hardened, pared-down view of language, can be seen on the fact of whether we read Silas's death a tragic, something that could be avoided, something that was unnecessary, and something that was precipitated by the delay and the argument, or if we see Silas's death as something that was bound to happen, something which was timed along with this conversation about what home is. If the poem describes the failure of Mary and Warren to provide Silas with a home and thereby to precipitate his death, then the poem sides with the sentimental and Christian, and in this case, feminine, reading of life. If, however, the poem describes not the failure but the success in providing Silas with a home, which is in fact what he was looking for, which he would have had anyway, that is death, then the poem supports a more physical, masculine, and somewhat aggressive view of life and language. That is our conclusion. We will stop with our reading of Robert Frost with this lecture and with this poem. We will continue and explore the work of other poets in the next lecture. Thank you.